Good night, class. Last class period, we were trying to talk about the rise and fall of Rome, and the last couple of lectures have been dealing with Rome. Now, this is the slide that we ended last time. Now, we're going to switch gears now that we've talked about the rise and fall of Rome, and we're going to talk about, well, what happened after Rome fell apart. So, the best way to look at this is what role did Rome play and what took Rome's place in Western Europe. Rome was the center of not only political authority, but it was a social and cultural center as well. So when Rome falls apart, what holds Western Europe together? What is the core of Western identity? And of course, that is Christian church. Christianity had transformed from a persecuted religion to the official religion of the Roman Empire around 313 AD. This is all due to the Roman Emperor Constantine. Now, Constantine is an interesting character because Constantine was the son of another Roman emperor, would rise through that tetrarchy that we talked about of the Diocletian reforms. He would actually study at the court of Emperor Diocletian. Now, when Diocletian steps down, the power shift is not an easy one. Not to go into too much detail, but civil war breaks out because there are various people vying for the position of emperor. Now, Constantine will actually become not only the Eastern emperor, but for a short period of time, he will reunify the Roman Empire under his rule. He will be both the Eastern emperor and the Western emperor at the same time. This, of course, is just the opposite of what Diocletian had done, which is divide the empire between two co-rulers. Now, one reason why Constantine converts to Christianity is that he is vying for power with various different opponents. Your book goes into a little bit more detail than we will during the lecture. But this conversion to Christianity is more than just wanting to find a way to usurp power from his political opponents. From all we know, Constantine truly believed in Christianity. The only problem is, for Constantine, he didn't know what kind of Christianity to believe in, because this is one of the more controversial elements of our class and may cause some of you to question your own background religiously. Because the problem for Christianity around the time of Constantine is that there were numerous different types of Christianity. Remember, Jesus, the source of Christianity, the teacher of Christianity, was no longer around. The Christian church developed because of the views of his followers, and he had 12 of them. And each one of these 12 disciples would start their own Christian churches. You also have the various apostles, like the Apostle Paul, who would found and continually communicate with various Christian churches. And up until 325 AD, many of these Christian religions had distinct differences, is the best way to put it. Some Christians believed that Jesus was the Son of God. Others, like so-called Arians, believed that God had created Jesus in the same manner that a demigod like Hercules was created in Greek mythology. These distinctions in Christianity needed to be clarified, especially if Constantine was going to make it the official religion of the Roman Empire under his rule. He needed a standardized religion. So in 325, he calls the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea would clarify and codify church dogma. It would basically give us the basics of what most Christians believe today. Now, if I was in class, I would ask if anybody here had heard of the Nicene Creed, and I would wait for people to answer. But since we're not in class, I will go ahead and show it to you. The Nicene Creed is this. If you read this, you will notice that these are the basics of almost every Christian religion. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, creator of the universe. We believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, but also God himself, and that he was crucified, and on the third day he rose from the grave. Christians also believe in a Trinity, and the third part of the Trinity was the Holy Spirit, the giver of life. This sort of ghostly part of God, which all three parts are part of God, that works through his prophets, works through the believers. We take this for granted if you've grown up in the Christian religion. You take this simple creed for granted. But this is what that council had to come up with. Now, what happens to believers like the Arians? Well, those that do not fit into the Nicene Creed are given a choice: convert to the new form of Christianity or be declared heretics. Now, Constantine, even though he makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, he passes a series of laws that tolerates other religions within the empire, including the traditional Greco-Roman pantheon of gods. However, one of Constantine's successors, the Eastern Emperor Theodosius, who ruled from 379 to 395, makes Christianity the only religion in the Roman Empire, or at least at this time, what's going to be the Eastern Empire. Now, this is a major shift in Roman society because Christianity, at least the religious side of Christianity, argues that all men are created equal and are equal before God. There's no difference between rich man, poor man. Now, this goes against Roman society. As we've already talked about, Rome was a hierarchical, class-based society where you had patricians of various ranks, you had commoners, and you had slaves. We talked about how those of higher rank could impose themselves politically, socially, even sexually on those of lower rank. And women benefited from this because if you were the wife or the daughter of a high-ranking Roman citizen, Roman male, despite the fact that Rome was a patriarchal society, you, by extension, had status. Now, with this conversion to a religion that stresses the equality of men, basically women become second-class citizens regardless of social rank. Now, one thing that we need to point out is that by the mid-400s, the Western Empire is gone. The Western Empire has collapsed on itself and is basically replaced by small little fiefdoms of various Germanic tribes or Roman landholders that basically just say, we're not looking to Rome, we're going to try and run things ourselves. However, in the Eastern Empire, you still have a centralized government headed by an emperor. And in the East, the church adopts a policy that is known as Caesaropapism. Caesaropapism is simple. the religious leaders of the church, and at this time there is no singular leader of the church in the East or the West. The religious leaders will deal with religious issues. However, in enforcing church dogma, it will be the emperor, hence the Caesaro part of Caesaropapism. It is the emperor who will act as the secular authority within the church. So, in effect, there is no separation of church and state in the Byzantine Empire in the East. Now, this fact that you have an emperor in the East who is taking part in church matters will play a key role in the division of this once unified Christian church between the West and the East. However, before we talk about this, we need to point out something. Even with the Nicene Creed, even with other councils and conferences, it will take the work of Christian scholars like St. Augustine or Jerome, St. Jerome, to refine Christianity. It is men like St. Augustine and Jerome who are educated in Roman and Greek philosophy. It is up to them to make Christianity a fleshed out and full-fledged religion. Not just a belief structure, but a religion. Now, St. Augustine is a convert to Christianity. His mother was a Christian, however, he will convert in 387 AD. It is St. Augustine who uses Greek philosophers like Plato to define heaven, to define how Christianity relates to that time in history. Now, St. Augustine and Jerome and other scholars' work is more important than just fleshing out the philosophy, or what in religion is called theology of religion. By making Christianity something that people can read about, can find out about, and understand, it made this religion attractive to, well, powerful individuals like Germanic kings. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Or other important individuals in this post-Roman society. Now in the West, the church is going to, well, it's going to be the one unifying force in the West, and it's actually going to perform functions that would normally be performed by a state or a government. Functions that in the East, the still existent Byzantine Empire, the empire was carrying out. In the West, the monasteries and convents would perform social functions. Your book goes into greater detail of how these monasteries and convents developed. But let's just kind of talk about them in generalities right now. What is a monastery? Well, this is where monks go to meditate, to study, and to pray. However, to do this means that they have to be educated. They are the religious scholars of the age. And as such, they will be the protectors of Western Europe's past knowledge. The reason why we still have access to the Greek philosophers, the Roman philosophers, the great Roman orators, is because they saved these documents from the trash bin of history because they used them as they studied and tried to flesh out Christianity. Now, monasteries also perform an important function for an expanding religion like Christianity. As Christianity expands into this post-Roman Empire, Roman world, churches become the centers of these new communities, these new Christian communities. Because after Rome falls, this advanced civilization that had an empire-wide economy that supported educated classes is gone. So the vast majority of people who live in this, quote, dark age of European history are uneducated, illiterate, and are too busy trying to scratch out a living to worry about, well, studying Christianity. So they go to church to find out what Christianity is. They go to church to have the Bible read to them because they can't read it themselves. Even if they were literate in their own language, the Bible, as originally written, is in Hebrew and Greek. Now the monasteries will, like Jerome, the monks will translate this into Latin. Now even then, most people didn't read Latin. It's a dead language today. But these monks, living and serving in these monasteries, would not only translate the Bible in Latin, they would copy it. So you have basically an early assembly line before the advent of the printing press of these monks who, in their time that they're not in meditation or prayer, who are copying the Bible so that new churches at least have one copy. Now, since these monasteries are the repository of past knowledge, as Western Europe, I should be more specific, starts to recover from the collapse of Rome, the powerful rulers that are going to emerge, well, they want their sons to be educated. So they're going to send their children, their male children, to study at these monasteries. And as this becomes more and more of a practice, the monasteries will become schools. They will become centers of learning. And it's by no coincidence that if you look at major European universities today, like Oxford in England, they started out as monasteries. Oxford started out as a monastery and evolved into a religious school, and finally is a world-class, well-respected institution to this day. Now, what about the convents? Who's in the convents? Well, the convents are the female version for monasteries, but they have distinctly different functions. Whereas the monasteries are about learning and about preserving knowledge, convents are more administering to the poor, and more importantly, administering to the sick and needy. So the nuns will start out administering to the sick and the hungry. But as these convents develop, and as Europe again evolves and moves beyond the collapse of Rome, these convents will become places that people seek out for treatment. People who have terminal diseases, especially the wealthy who can donate, tithe and gifts to the convents, will literally go there to live out their last days if they have some serious illness. As a result, many of the earliest hospitals in Europe, of course, are outgrowths of these convents. Now in the West, unlike the East, the church is that one common power that crosses the very small little fiefdoms and small political units that make up Europe. There is no secular authority like the emperor in the West. So the Patriarch of Rome, in Latin this translates to roughly the Pope, the Patriarch of Rome is basically a religious but also a secular leader. And so until 800 AD, the popes in Rome had to not only share authority with the other patriarchs in the church, because up until this time period, until around 800 to 1000 AD, there is just one church, and the religious leaders are patriarchs. And these patriarchs can be the Patriarch of Rome, the Patriarch of Antioch, the Patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt, or the Patriarch of Constantinople. However, even though the popes share authority with those other religious patriarchs, theoretically, and let me stress, this is very theoretically, the Pope shares power with the Byzantine Emperor. However, this, of course, didn't sit well with church leaders in the West, because the Byzantine Emperor didn't exert any secular authority over the West because, well, that was outside the empire. People in the West, they didn't benefit from the authority or protection of the Byzantine Emperor. So why should the Byzantine Emperor have any say in the religious policies of the Pope? Now, one of these patriarchs, one of these Roman popes, a fellow by the name of Gregory I, sometimes called Gregory the Great, who was Pope from 590 to 604 AD, advanced a new doctrine to justify having the Pope free of not only the Byzantine Emperor, but also the other patriarchs. Gregory the Great advanced the idea of Petrine doctrine. Petrine doctrine is simple. The Patriarch of Rome is superior to not only the Byzantine Emperor, but also the other patriarchs. Because according to Petrine doctrine, Christ, Jesus, before he is crucified in the Bible, he leans over to Paul, the Last Supper, and he says, or not Paul, but Peter, leans over to Peter at the Last Supper and says, "Peter, you are the rock I'm going to found my church on." And so, supporters of Petrine doctrine argue that this is a recorded example of Jesus passing the baton of power, control of the church, to Peter. So, if Jesus is handing the baton of leadership to Peter, and Peter becomes the first patriarch of Rome, logically, his successors in Rome are the head of the Christian church. That's how Petrine doctrine goes. That's the logic behind it. Well, of course, this doesn't sit well with the other patriarchs. And finally, after much debate, and after the fact that there are other differences between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, the two leaders, the Pope in Rome and the collective leadership of the other patriarchs in the Eastern Empire, mutually excommunicate each other. If you don't know what excommunication is to declare that a person is no longer part of the Christian church. They are cut off from the church. And since at this time the belief is you need to be part of the church body in order to have access to God, the church is the middleman. The church is the link. And without that link, you are doomed to be outside of the light of God and doomed to eternal damnation in hell. And the Pope excommunicates the other patriarchs, and the other patriarchs excommunicate the Pope. Now, what are the other differences? Because these are important to understanding the development of these two religions. One is that in the Western Church, what is now called the Catholic Church, they believe in what are called relics. Relics are any item that Catholics believe holds some religious and spiritual significance. They hold some religious or spiritual power, like the Shroud of Turin, the shroud that supposedly Jesus was wrapped in when he was buried in the tomb. Or literally body parts, like fingers of early Christians who died for the faith, early saints. However, in the Orthodox Church, as the Eastern part of the religion will become to be known, they view relics as idol worship. And of course, this breaches the Ten Commandments. And as such, in the Orthodox religion, they wage war. They call this iconophory. to basically seek out and find these icons, these relics, and destroy them. Those that believe in the Orthodox religion go as far as to forbidding stained glass windows that have, well, pictures in them. They can have stained glass windows, but they can't be of any image. Otherwise, they would be considered an icon to be destroyed. Now, politically, let's look at what was Rome looks like around 300 to 400 AD. Here's a map that it says it's about 500 AD. So it's actually probably a little bit more organized than the time period that we have been talking about. But even now you can see that there is no unified control over the western part of Europe. And this is a simplified map. Because let's take the Frankish kingdom, for example. The Franks considered it one unified kingdom. However, there were multiple Frankish kings who ruled over smaller portions of the, quote, Frankish kingdom at any one time. So before about 700 to 800 AD, even though, as according to this picture right here, this illustration, these kingdoms were much more fragmented than this image implies. The kingdom of the Franks, the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, all of these kingdoms were much more fragmented and had multiple rulers in them. It's not until about 770 AD that you have a unified kingdom in Europe ruled by a single man. And this, of course, is the kingdom of the Franks ruled under Charlemagne. So how do we get to Charlemagne? Well, it's important to understand where Charlemagne comes from. The kingdom of the Franks originates around 481 to 485 AD. The first rulers were of the Merovingian dynasty. The first Merovingian was a fellow by the name of, if I'm pronouncing this right, Chelderic I. However, it is Chelderic's son, Clovis, that is more important. Clovis, who ruled between 481 and 511 AD, is one of the first Germanic Franks to convert to Christianity. In doing so, the entire Frankish kingdom starts the process of converting to Christianity as well. It's also Clovis who tries to consolidate the Germanic and Latin traditions. Because remember, you have these Germanic tribes like the Franks invading into what was the Roman world, a world that had been Latinized by Rome. And these Germanic tribes set down roots, and they're living alongside the former residents that had been ruled by Rome and had accepted Rome's traditions and values. So Clovis sets about trying to consolidate not only what we call cultural traditions, but things like the law, to try and come up with something that everyone inside the Frankish kingdom will accept. And even while Clovis is theoretically the head of the Frankish kingdom, he is not the singular head of the kingdom of the Franks. There are other power brokers. One of the most notable is a fellow by the name of Charles Martel. Now the Merovingians will continue until Pepin the Short, a local noble and what you might call sub-king, one of these numerous kings that serve underneath the Merovingian dynasty, with the help of Pope Zachary I, helps to excommunicate the last Merovingian ruler, a fellow by the name of Chelderic III. With the removal of Chelderic III, Pepin the Short declares himself to be king of the Franks and starts a new dynasty. This is known as the Carolingian dynasty. And Pepin's son, Charles, will have the greatest effect on Western Europe up until this time. Now, Charles, otherwise known as Charlemagne or Charles the Great, begins his rule around 768-770 AD, and he is king of the Franks. And he expands his centralized control over the kingdom of the Franks by waging war against his internal opponents and also external opponents like the Saxons and other Germanic tribes that are outside the boundaries of the Frankish kingdom. Now, around 800 AD, Charlemagne is given the title of emperor, not of the kingdom of the Franks, but of a new Holy Roman Empire. Now, how does he become this emperor of this new Holy Roman Empire? Well, in 800 AD, the Pope requests aid from Charlemagne. He's about to be expelled, to be run out, chased out of Rome by angry crowds. At this time, Rome is in a state of chaos. Charlemagne marches down the Italian boot, conquering those Italian territories, bringing order to Rome, and as a result, the Pope crowns Charlemagne an emperor of this new Holy Roman Empire. Of course, the Holy Roman Empire will be, of course, his Frankish kingdom. Now, the coronation of Charlemagne is important because when Charlemagne is crowned, he approaches the Pope, kneels, and the Pope places the crown of the Holy Roman Empire on his head. This is not only symbolic, but is also important for the politics of the medieval age in European history. Because by doing so, Charlemagne is allowing the Pope to say that symbolically all power comes from the Church. And every Pope after this time will claim to have dominion, will have power over European rulers, because this is a symbolic justification of power after this point. Power comes from the Church. And as a result, the Church as an institution will not just be a religious organization, but will wield massive amounts of secular power. It will be very much a contender for power with any European ruler. And we'll see. We'll go over some examples of this later on in class. Now, Charlemagne, after becoming Holy Roman Emperor, will also go about trying to redefine what it means to be European in his realm. He will set standards of writing and learning in the Holy Roman Empire. He will help fund monasteries and make them centers of learning and education. He will also basically demand that a new language be created, something that incorporates the heritage of both the Germanic Frankish tribes, but also the Latin of Rome. And of course, what comes out of this is French, because it's the Franks who are the forefathers of the modern-day French. Now, why don't we see a large Holy Roman Empire consolidating power over Europe? Well, the problem is when Charlemagne dies, this begins the process of a disintegration of his empire. Now, Charles has one son, a fellow who goes by the title or the name of Louis the Pious. However, Louis the Pious has three sons: Charles the Bald, Lothar, and Louis the German. Now, if you turn to page 225 in your book, there's a small little map down in the corner, and you can see that Charles the Bald gets the westernmost portion in brown on the map. Lothar gets the middle blue section that includes what is today eastern France and the northernmost part of Italy. And Louis the German gets what is today the westernmost part of Germany. Well, Lothar sort of gets the raw end of the deal, because his two brothers will gang up on him and seize his empire through conquest. And they'll split his part of the Holy Roman Empire between the two of them. And, of course, this leads to the, well, in a lot of ways, this is the precursor to many of the problems between France and Germany. So, one of the problems is that in splitting the empire between the two most powerful sons will set the stage for the continued animosity between those people who will become known as the French and those people who will become known as Germans. Now, before we go further, we need to recognize that these Germanic tribes who are blending or merging with what was left of Roman society are not the only ones in Europe. We also have some Germanic peoples who are not going to merge with Rome. These are, of course, the Northmen, otherwise known as the Vikings. They come from modern-day Scandinavia, modern-day Denmark, Norway, and the second Norway should be Sweden, and Finland. Even your professor can make mistakes. Now, these are the last pagans in Europe. What do I mean by pagans? Well, pagans loosely today means anybody who doesn't believe in Christianity. But there's actually a more specific definition for pagan. Pagans are those that believe in religions that stress naturalistic forces. The Vikings are one such group. Like their Germanic counterparts on the continent, they prize fighting skills, and revenge is socially acceptable. However, because of where they're from, raiding is an integral part of their life. The other Germanic peoples of Europe were not just warriors, but also farmers. One reason they were moving into Roman-held land was that they were being pushed by more powerful tribes, more powerful people like the Huns. And of course they were being driven from the lands that they had colonized and were farming. The Vikings, on the other hand, come from Scandinavia, and the growing season in Scandinavia is incredibly short. As a result, the Vikings raid areas seeking cattle, agricultural products, food, things like that, something that they can seize and take back with them. Now, the Vikings are also, well, some of Europe's first explorers, because as raiders, they need to find out where the good hunting grounds for, taking other people's stuff are at. As a result, the Vikings will discover for Europeans and settle modern-day Iceland, modern-day Greenland, and there is good evidence that the first Europeans in North America were not the Spanish, but instead Vikings around 1000 AD. The Vikings will also, as they raid, will set up a colony on the mainland of Europe, on what is today the French coast. They will become known as the Norman French. Now, of course, their realm in France will become known as Normandy, the same place that U.S. forces landed in 1944. Now, why do we need to know about the Vikings? Well, we need to know about the Vikings and their raiding culture in order to understand how other European rulers and other European peoples reacted to the Vikings, because the Vikings are raiding the British Isles, they're raiding the French coast, and how these Europeans react to raids by the Vikings will determine how their societies develop. One such area are the British Isles. Now, Britain, at least the lower part of it, had been conquered under Rome. Now, before the Roman conquest, Britain was the best way to put it, a hodgepodge of various Celtic tribes, the Picts, the Scots, the Welsh. And when the Romans invaded, they either Latinized or pushed these Celtic tribes north in order to keep their society protected, as you see on this map on the screen. Roman emperors of the era, namely Emperor Hadrian and Emperor Antonio, I think it's Pius, Antonio Pius, built walls literally to hold these people back. Now, Hadrian's wall is the more famous of the two walls. Hadrian's wall is that stone wall that goes completely across England. At the time, historians and archaeologists believe that it was about 8 feet tall. Now it's basically just a bunch of rocks strewn on the ground because it's been partially disassembled for people to build their houses out of. But it was a stone wall. Now, and the Antonine Wall was an earthen and wood wall, less structurally formidable, but it was further north, and of course it was shorter. Now, with the evacuation of Roman forces around 400 AD, these defenses become mute, and the people of the British Isles, again, the various Celtic tribes and the leftover Latinized peoples, have to deal with invasions. One of the first invasions are the invasions of first the Angles and then the Saxons. The Angles and the Saxons are two different Germanic tribes that come over. They originate in Central Europe, and they literally stage an amphibious invasion of the British Isles. Now, one of the first Anglish king, this is where English comes from. It starts out as Anglish. One of the first Anglish kings is Alfred I, or Alfred the Great. He rules between 871 and 899 AD. So, what are Alfred's policies? Well, his policies are linked directly to defending his kingdom against the Saxons from the north and the Vikings from the coast. He institutes what becomes known as the Burgle system. Alfred is the ruler of a relatively cash-poor land, as are most of these small feudal states in Europe after the fall of Rome. There is no strong economy. There's no currency. So what's the coin of the realm? What's the asset that gives people power? Well, it's land. And so what Alfred does is he creates what he calls burghs. And so these burghs, B-U-R-H-S, B-U-R-H-S, these are fortified locations that he basically gives to nobles under him, loyal supporters, and assigns them the duty of keeping this fortification up and ready, keeping it staffed, and keeping it armed, so that in case of invasion, these burghs, these central fortified locations, could be used as a place where people could go to, get arms, organize, and repel invasions. And in exchange for doing this, these local subordinates get control of the land in the name of the king, in the name of Alfred the Great. Now, Alfred also is known for the commissioning of what is known as the Dambach, or more sinisterly known as the Book of Doom. Now, the Book of Doom is kind of a misnomer, because it's not really as evil as it sounds. Instead, the Dambach is a clarification and a codification of law. This is the basis of English law. This is important because English common law, as it will become known, is the basis of American law. The Dambach basically takes English and even Saxon legal traditions and cultural traditions, combines it with Roman law and Christian ideals to come up with a new legal system, or at least the foundations for that. Now, Alfred's dynasty will last until 1066. One of his descendants, King Harold I, the Anglo-Saxon king of England, will have to defend his realm against the conquest of the Norman French, led by William the Conqueror. Now, William the Conqueror, of course, will live up to his name, and he will defeat Harold II at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and introduce not only the French language and French customs, but also French legal traditions and French and Norman legal traditions into England. And all of this is going to meld together into British common law that we know today, and of course is the basis of American law. Now, let's look at generally how Europe is developing at this time. Because the best way to describe this is Europe is ruled by the strongest. All of these men that we have talked about, whether it be Alfred, whether it be the Norman kings, whether it be Charlemagne, the reason why they are able to consolidate power is because they are successful military leaders. And so the king, and I use this in quotes on the slide here, the king is really, well, he's the guy who controls the land through his control of military force. And in a lot of ways, this control depended on the support he had of his subordinates. So while there may have been a king, control of the land really rests with that of the local lords, his subordinates. They're the ones that administer the land. They're the ones that dispense justice. In many cases, they mint their own money, levy their own taxes, and have their own vassals under them. In a way, the kings are just first among equals. This will develop, this idea of control of land will develop into what is known as feudalism, because feudalism as a system is not a system where people just sit down and decide, okay, what is the feudal system going to be? This is a system that was developed through evolution rather than people sitting down and deciding what it's going to be. It was developed, it evolved out of a need to fight invaders and maintain control of the land on the cheap without having to spend any money. And so what it does is those men, those nobles as they become known, who control land, will gain the loyalty of their subordinates by giving them the rights to control a small portion of that land. So lords gave their land to retainers, their vassals. So if you hear the term vassal retainer, it means the person that a lord grants that land to in exchange for loyalty. In exchange for loyal service, the vassal retainer got to control their land as they saw fit, as long as they paid taxes to their lord and as long as they were at their lord's call in case of the need for service, basically military service. So what this develops into is a military system where the king at the top grants a large section of his land to a upper noble, an immediate subordinate, whether that be called a baron or a duke or whoever. And this immediate subordinate, let's call them barons, will themselves divide that land up and hand it out in exchange for loyalty to their immediate subordinates. And this process will go on until you get down to the last rung of the noble class, as it becomes known, which is the knight. The knight is the armed and trained foot soldier of the feudal system. So while the kings, the dukes, and the barons will act as administrators or higher level military commanders, the actual armed, trained soldier is the knight. And so the knight will be granted a small fiefdom, as it becomes known, to support himself while he trains to fight. But since knights are going to train all the time, they can't farm their own land. So the last rung, outside of the feudal class, a new class will be created. This class will be made up of the already inexistent peasants who are scratching out a living in the countryside, in exchange for protection, in exchange for basically being protected against outlaws or other military forces. The peasants will declare themselves a vassal to the knight, and that they will farm his land in exchange for protection and governance. And of course, this will provide the knights with the sustenance that they need to feed themselves while they train, to equip themselves. And of course, they will pay taxes to their landlords. That's where the term landlord comes from. And of course, the landlord of the knights will pay homage and pay tribute taxes to his lord until finally the king gets his cut. All of this has to do with who controls the land, because the feudal system at its core is about two things: providing a military force without having to spend anything for it, and since land is worthless without it producing something, controlling the labor that will produce those products, namely agricultural products. And what you get out of this for the peasants is serfdom. Because as I said, free peasants would seek out the protection from lords in exchange for labor and obedience. And as this evolves, these peasants become known as peasant serfs, or just serfs. Now, serfs are not slaves. They can't be sold. They enjoy certain rights as outlined by their class. However, they are tied to the land. They are not free to leave the land. When they accept the protection of a lord, they're literally signing their freedom away and becoming part of the land, the same as the landscape and the buildings. And they can be traded when the land is traded. So if I'm one landlord and say I've got this little bit of land that sticks out here into another lord's land, I can make a deal with him and say, hey, you can have that little sliver right there, but I'll take this little sliver of yours down here. Well, when we exchange that land, we exchange the serfs with it. Now, feudalism, unlike slavery, outlines certain roles and certain duties for both the landlord and the serf. Let's look at the serf's obligations. The serf has to work the land, but they also had to work, the landlord's land. So there's a bit of land that they are not given, but they're given the right to farm. But in exchange for this, they either have to pay form of tax in kind, or they have to pay in labor by farming the lord's land. In exchange, they had to perform labor services, pay rents in kind, as I say. Male serfs typically had to work 3 days a week. They also had to work harder during planting and harvesting time. And women also had to perform certain functions, as I outline here on the slides as well. What are the Lord's obligations? Well, of course, the basic obligation is that he has to hand out land, and these entitlements, these gifts of land rights are inheritable. Now, the Lord also provided capital-intensive items such as grist mills, oven, forges, minor manufacturing products. And of course, the Lord had to provide protection. He had to provide protection from external threats, but he also had to provide protection from internal threats by being the law of the land. And as such, the Lord or his representatives would be in charge of administering justice. Now, as this evolves in Europe through the early and then high Middle Ages, this develops into a system of what are known as feudal manors. These manors were the large estates of the various landlords. And so, in a lot of ways, these feudal manors become semi-independent and economically isolated islands because the landlord provided the government, the administration, the police services, and the justice for each manor. The landlord sometimes minted his own money. And since currency as we know it, like the dollar bill, was not in a large circulation at this time, you didn't have currency. The coin of the realm was product, was what the feudal manor was growing. These feudal manors were oftentimes self-sufficient. They grew everything that they needed. The landlord only sold what he needed in order to get those products that were not readily available on his own manor. And so these feudal manors become the central feature of social and cultural life in Europe at this time. Now, what is the culture of feudalism? Well, it is a culture of hierarchy. You have three classes in medieval Europe. You have at the top the clergy, the church. The church is the all-important institution in medieval Europe. Below that, you have the noble class. These are the people who provide justice, administer the land, and most importantly, they're the ones that fight. And then below that, the peasants, the serfs. Now, this hierarchy was justified because of what the church said was in the Bible. Because according to the church, there was hierarchy in the world. God created the universe, then he created the beast in the fields, and then finally he created man. So if there is hierarchy in nature, there's also hierarchy in the church as it evolves. Why is there not hierarchy in man? So they justified this very rigid hierarchy through the Bible. And even within the classes, there was hierarchy. There's church hierarchy. There's hierarchy within the noble class. And there's hierarchy among the serfs. There are some serfs that have more power because they have their landlord's ear, if you will. And then there's those that do not. So if I ask you what is a defining element of feudalism in the medieval era, hierarchy is at the top of the list. And as I said, you have three classes. You have those who pray, the clergy, those who fight, the nobles, and those who work, the peasants. And this is a very unequal, very stratified society. It's probably a society that most of us would not want to live in. But one reason why it existed from at least around 800, 700, 800 AD, all the way up into the 1600s, is because it was not imposed on everybody, but it was accepted. It was accepted by the clergy. It was accepted by the nobility, and it was even accepted by the peasantry. Now, early on, this system, well, it had its problems. These self-contained manors with lack of central authority often led to abuses. Nobles vied for territory with each other. They fought amongst themselves. Nobles also abused the power that they were given. So, they overtaxed the peasants. They took advantage of women that were under their authority, and they just sometimes even just out and out killed people under their authority just because they felt like it. This violence was commonplace. And so, how do you control this? The peasants didn't rise up for the most part and demand their rights, because most peasants saw this as their lot in life and instead turned to the church for help. And of course, this leads to the birth of chivalry. Around 1100 AD, the Catholic popes, seeing that this violence and this internal strife could possibly tear Christianity apart. I mean, Christianity by that time had already split in half between Catholics and Orthodox. The fear was that Christianity would continue to fragment. So instead, the Catholic Church stresses that for nobles to justify their position, they must live by the code of chivalry. So that in order for a nobleman to justify their place, they had to uphold certain values. They had to devote themselves to social order, piety, Christian ideals, defending the weak, defending defending women, for example. And by the 12th century, this would be codified into a code. In order for a person to become a knight, they had to accept this code. They had to accept this idea that they had to live by a code that they were in the service of God. Now, next time, we're going to talk about the rise of Islam. Because until we talk about Islam, which I'm going to have posted here probably late tomorrow or Saturday, we can't talk about the High Middle Ages as they're known until we talk about Islam. Because the High Middle Ages, this period from about 1066 up until the mid-1300s, is defined by the Christian Crusades into the Holy Land. The Christian Crusades happened because of the rise of Islam. So in order for us to understand the Crusades, for us to understand the culture of the High Middle Ages, we have to understand Islam. So there'll be a short online lecture about where Islam comes from, what is it, and how did it affect Europe. So next time, be prepared to look at that. And that's what we'll be discussing, along with the early Middle Ages, as well as cleaning up aspects of the fall of Rome. We'll be talking about all of these three things during our next class period. I will also be sending out an email of these general questions that I want you guys to prime yourselves on so that you're ready to have a true discussion. Not just me needling you and trying to pull answers out of you. We should be having a more free-flowing discussion. So I'm going to let you guys go and get this thing processed and uploaded, so it will be available to you late today or early Friday. And I will see you guys in class on Monday. Thank you very much.